this webinar. Really appreciate everyone for being here today to learn more about the 2021 amendment to the Eastside screens, and in particular the adaptive management component of that, which involves opportunities for you all to get involved, share what you're seeing on the landscape, and help us improve implementation of this land management policy going forward. I'll start off with just a bit of information about what we intend to present today, our agenda, our objectives, what we're hoping you'll all come away with, and starting with the team that's going to be presenting with me today. So to introduce myself, I'm Nick Goldstein. I am the Regional Planner at the Forest Service's Pacific Northwest Regional Office based in Portland. And with me today, and I'll encourage all of my fellow co-presenters, if you're able to turn on your cameras quickly as I introduce you. We have Craig Trulock, who's the Forest Supervisor on the Malheur National Forest, and our line officer lead for implementation of this amendment. We have Emily Platt, who's going to present on some of the large and old tree components of the amendment. She was the lead for development of this land management plan amendment. So really appreciate having her on the line with us today. And then in addition to Craig and Emily and myself, we will be presenting some of the, proactively presenting some of the substance of this amendment. We also have some additional experts from the Forest Service Regional Office on the line to help answer questions and chime in with their expertise as needed. And those folks include Tom DeMeo, our forest ecologist in the regional office, Marin Palmer, a biometrician, Robin Darbyshire, a silviculturist, Carrie Spradlin, also a silviculturist on our planning team, Matt Ehrman, my fellow planner in the regional office and our lead for monitoring, and Barbara Garcia, a wildlife biologist in the RO. So thanks all to the Forest Service team for being here and supporting us today. On the right-hand side of your screen, you'll see our agenda for today. We'll start off going to Craig to cover the agency's intent for the Eastside screens and the adaptive management component. We'll then give an overview of the 2021 amendment, specifically focusing on the snag and green tree retention components, which I'll present on, and then the large and old tree guideline, which Emily will present. We'll then dive into the adaptive management strategy and preview what's coming in that regard. And then we'll have plenty of time throughout for Q&A. We've got a few different slides peppered in just at key points to stop and hear what's on your mind. And then we'll also have opportunity at the very end there for open comments or questions on anything we present today. Before we dive in, I do want to just acknowledge that the invite for this, we worked with Sustainable Northwest to target this invite to stakeholders on the 6 affected units, so the Eastside screen units on the east side of Oregon, and the Umatilla, of course, touching into Southeast Washington State. That said, we know the invite reached others, collaborative members from some other units. Just please keep in mind that if the Eastside screens do not apply on your unit, it's probably a little less relevant to your direct interest. And so we just ask that you preserve some space in the Q&A sections for stakeholders on those Eastside screen units to ask questions and get their voices in the room. Definitely welcome everyone to listen in, but would ask that we prioritize questions and commentary from staff, from stakeholders, I should say, on those 6 units. So thank you all in advance for that. And moving on now, we'll cover our objectives for today. So
hi, Nick.
Yeah, please, Trent.
Sorry to interrupt. You're in presenter view, so your slides are split for us.
Oh.
I don't know if you can modify that. Thanks.
Thanks for letting me know. I thought I had this all set. Does that work better? You seeing the full slide now?
Yes, great. Thank you.
Thanks for chiming in, Trent.
Yeah, just Nick, before you move on, I just wanted to let everyone know that the chat's going to be restricted to the host throughout the presentation. But all the panelists today and Nick will be getting your questions, we'll be feeding them. So don't worry if your question doesn't get answered right away. It's just so that the chat doesn't get flooded.
Thanks very much for that, Sally. All right, so back to our objectives for today. Here's what we hope you'll walk away knowing. First, understanding the amended direction. So some of the key points there: snags are to be retained as needed to support a diverse array of wildlife. There was some questions coming in about how to interpret the intent statement for the snag component of the amendment. And so that's the key point to know there, and we'll certainly cover that again. Secondly, the old and large tree guideline applies outside of late and old structure forest only. We will use external morphological characteristics, so we're assessing the look of a tree from the outside rather than using coring to assess age. So those are the three things that we want you all to know about the direction itself and how it operates. And then with regard to the adaptive management strategy, we'll review the required and the recommended monitoring questions, talk about upcoming engagement opportunities, and clarify the annual regional foresters data review, what that means, what the outcomes of that will be. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Craig to talk about the agency intent for this amendment and the adaptive management strategy associated with it. Craig, please.
All right, thanks, Nick. So for this session, what we're really trying to begin to do is understand and get to know, what are the monitoring requirements for this amendment, and begin to plan how we will accomplish that. And so both internally and externally, we have to have a better understanding of this as we move forward and create a good plan. And then this bullet on develop and process and tools to increase adaptability of management and respond to observed changes on the landscape. This is a lot about sharing knowledge both internally and externally. Like Nick has said, this is 6 units. And so we work pretty independently. And so getting a process where we can share tools and knowledge is pretty important. And so this might be NEPA input, it might be prescriptions that work really well on the ground and are giving us the outcomes we desire. Or it might just be more information to better tell our story of what we're trying to achieve and how we're achieving that. And then the last one, to ensure transparency and build trust, that is really one of our key things here, is to be as transparent as possible. And people should be able to, at a moment's notice, understand what it is we're trying to achieve. So back to you, Nick.
Great, thanks, Craig. And with that, we'll dive right in and start with a conversation about the Snag Standard, or the Snag Standard and associated guidelines. So what you see on your screen now is a paraphrased version of what's in the amendment itself. Tried to just simplify it as much as possible so that we've got fewer words on each slide and can just talk about what's really meant. So you see in the call out box there, the intent statement that's in the amendment for snags, and it is to retain existing snags, to provide for the recruitment of future snags in downwood. And there's the key statement underlined there: in order to support life history requirements for a diverse array of wildlife. The Snag Standard essentially gives members 2 options. The first is to maintain all snags greater than 21 inches diameter at breast height, or if the representative DBH of that overstory layer within the project area is less than 20 inches, then that smaller diameter would apply. So the first option there is either to maintain all snags greater than 21 inches, or where the representative DBH is slightly smaller, maintain all snags greater than that smaller number. That's the representative DBH of the project area. Again, DBH, diameter at breast height, for those who are not trained foresters. Though I suspect this is a savvy audience on the line today. And then the second option that the standard provides is to complete an analysis. The only parameters put on that in terms of what that analysis needs to look like, or that it applies best available science, and we can talk a little bit more about that. But the snag analysis should demonstrate what the ecological requirements are for a diverse array of species in order to inform compliance, consistency with that intent statement. So again, our intent statement requires that we are retaining existing snags to provide for recruitment of future snags in downwood in order to support a life history requirements for a diverse array of wildlife. And there's two ways to do that. We either maintain all snags, we'll call them large snags greater than 20 inches or the representative DBH, or complete a snag analysis using BASI on ecological requirements for diverse species. So I'm going over this a few times because it's pretty important and we've gotten a number of questions about it already. In regards to what that analysis should look like, right now, what I understand from our wildlife ecologists and silviculturists is that the decade analysis, the modeling available through decade is the best approach that we have available right now. However, we did not want to lock ourselves in the future into using that tool. Should a more refined model become available, should other tools become available, we wanted to preserve the flexibility to adapt that analysis methodology in the future. So the only real requirement there is that we're using the best available scientific information at that time. There's also a set of guidelines within the snag management direction, and that really focuses on removing snags when necessary for operational safety. So what considerations to apply in those instances to ensure safety. So a call out box here, just to reiterate that key point. This does not mean, this intent statement that we've highlighted here does not mean that all existing snags must be retained. That underlined portion of that intent statement is really key. And what it means is that snags are to be retained as needed to support a diverse array of wildlife. Next, we'll get into the green tree retention components of the amendment. The intent statement here is going to look really familiar. It's essentially the same as it was for snags. We would just have the words green trees in there instead. So the intent is to retain green trees to provide for recruitment of future snags in downwood in order to support life history requirements for a diverse array of wildlife. The standard I should say for green tree retention is to retain green trees to meet future snag and downwood recruitment for a diverse composition of wildlife species using best available science. It also requires the retention of partially hollow or hollow trees that could become snags in downwood whenever possible. There's, again, a set of guidelines associated with green tree retention, and those are really focused on site-specific considerations regarding which individual trees to retain. So it discusses things like species composition, height and size of individual trees, vulnerability of the stand to disturbance, or I should say of individual trees to a disturbance, considering clumping and grouping, looking for things like deformation, damage, and wounds on trees to consider whether they should be taken, and looking at slope and aspect. So that's in broad brush strokes, the direction for snags and downwood. And with that, we'll take a pause here and invite any questions on how those standards operate, how those standards and guidelines operate. And we can go back and look at either of those prior slides if that would be helpful. And Sally, I might look to you for some help with this facilitation, just because it's a little difficult for me to kind of jump around to the different screens and see if questions are coming in via chat.
Yep, nothing in the chat box so far, but if people do have questions, please pop them in now. I don't see any hands raised either.
I see Mark turned his video on. Do you have a question or comment, Mark?
I do, and I don't know quite how to operate this since I'm not on Zoom. So my question is this, that standard says retain snags as needed to support the life history for a diverse array of wildlife. Will that expectation be that you meet the diverse array of all wildlife on every acre of ground? And what would be a difference, say, between applying that standard in a cool moist forest stand versus a dry forest stand. We've had challenges in the past where we're trying to meet full array of guidelines or regulations on every acre of ground, and it's pretty compromising. And I'm just wondering how y'all are looking at implementing this in that way, if that makes sense.
Thanks for your question, Mark. Barb, I see you're on screen. It's a bit of a more technical question than I feel prepared to address, so I might toss it to you if you don't mind.
Not at all. Can you guys all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Perfect. Mark, that's a great question. Thanks for asking it. It's good to see you this morning. So the intent here is not to provide snags on every acre for every single species. What's driving this is viability of species, right? So we want to have the right amount for as many species as possible. So a smorgasbord of opportunities for as many wildlife species within the project area or within the planning unit, i.e. the forest, as possible. So in some cases, there are going to be species that have more snag requirements than others. But yes, that greatly depends on the ecological conditions, i.e. the HRV. So if something, that's what's driving the proposed actions, and therefore, the species that would historically have occurred there and should be occurring there into the future. So those prescriptions will be very grounded in HRV and will be providing the snag requirement for the species that should be occurring in those vegetation types under these HRV scenarios. So I recognize that that could be construed as every acre for every species, but not every species occurs on every acre. So I think that's where the wildlife biologists will need to describe to the line officers and to the public how how the proposed action fits in the context of the HRV analysis, the ecological conditions that we are trying to achieve on the ground, and how those relate to the wildlife species that occur within that area. I know that's a little bit more vague, Mark, but that's really how, in theory, this should play. This should be conducted on the ground.
No, that helps me. You are tying it to HRV, which I think is appropriate, and we think is appropriate. So thank you.
Thanks for the question, Mark.
Thanks, Mark and Barb. Anything more? Questions on the snag or green tree retention components?
Yep, there's a question from Lindsay. Are we assuming that these analyses are done at the watershed scale?
Barb, can you address that? Is the decade analysis at the watershed scale?
So decade can be ran at several, or I don't use the word run because it's not a model, but decade can be assessed at multiple scales, but the watershed scale is probably the most appropriate, anything watershed and above. That doesn't mean that the forest or district could not choose to what we call cookie cut a portion, the project area, into a smaller analysis, but there are some caveats in terms of what the data can do and what they can't. And the wildlife biologists should be disclosing those in the analysis. Typically, when we take it to the project level, we are comparing the decade watersheds with then the forest wide. So there's multiple spatial scales we're looking at given the snag variability on the ground. And when we get to the point at the project level where we start to feel that we need a little bit extra data, that is where we start to include things like FSVEG, LIDAR, other maybe on the ground plots that we would want to see on the ground, since that uncertainty is not accounted for at those larger spatial scales. So that's all within the privy using best available science for the districts when they get to that point.
And I see a few more technical questions in the chat from Doug. Which decade tolerance level are we using for this analysis?
So decade tolerance levels are, there's 3 different tolerance levels that are included in the decade platform. Most of you know, each analysis kind of assesses the HRV conditions, and they're comparing those tolerance levels with those HRV conditions. So it really depends on the proposed action and those HRV conditions. There's no standard tolerance level.
Thanks, Barb. There's a couple other questions for Doug here, and I know James wants to get in as well. The the two others from Doug are first, diverse wildlife, but for what population level? To the extent you're asking about a population potential level, the amendment does not include population potential tables or specific figures in that regard. The second question from Doug was about what is the regional plan to provide abundant large snags to the species that need the most large snags and are most sensitive to their absence. So, to the extent you're asking about a regional plan, the Eastside screens are limited to the Eastside units, and within that planning area, what you see on the screen is the plan for ensuring abundant large snags into the future. So I'm not sure, Barb, if you've got more to say on either of those questions, either with regard to the population potential numbers or how we're ensuring that species that need large snags have them.
Right. So I don't have anything. Oh, sorry, I got a really bad echo there. I don't have anything additional to add to the population potential, except for if, Doug, I'm always, if you want to talk offline or we want to have a discussion on population potential, that's an hour-long conversation in and of itself. But basically, population potential, as you guys know, was visionary for its time, but is now recognized largely as being very focused on primary cavity nesters and nesting habitat only. So what we're intending to do with this amendment was to provide snags for a diverse array of wildlife, not just primary cavity nesters as it was intended with the population potential in the 1970s. Given a regional perspective, I think Nick covered that very well. There are provisions under the Northwest Forest Plan, and certainly as we run through revision for those forests, as well as the Eastside screens, but the intent here would be to provide for that diverse array of wildlife for those large snag requirements based on best available science. And then was there something else in there, Nick? I'm sorry.
No, I think you covered it well. I know James Johnson has a question. We'll get him in one sec. Trent has also put a question in the chat, and it kind of builds on what you were just describing. His question reads, diverse array because of different forest plans and MIS, management indicator species. My presumption is yes, right? Each forest is going to have different species present. And so for a broad programmatic amendment that covers 6 forests, we are allowing for that flexibility to consider the appropriate species within the project level planning area. Anything more you want to say about that, Barb?
No, correct, Trent. Each of the 6 forests has some similarities in their management indicator species, but there's quite a bit of diversity as well. So we didn't want to have limit forests in terms of where they want to go with ecological conditions for those species by tick marking all of them out and then becoming more groups of species oriented versus ecological conditions for a wide array of different species that may or may not be MIS. There may be other species that we care about on the landscape, but just weren't designated as management indicator species at the time. So that was an intent there, a deliberate intent to really try to incorporate the species that require those ecological conditions and how they function within that ecosystem.
Thanks, Barb. And James, let's please get you in here. Feel free to turn on your camera and unmute. And then after that, I think we will need to move on and talk about the large and all tree guideline.
I hope folks can hear me. This is James Johnston. My question was, when the Forest Service says use best available science with respect to snag planning, does that just mean use the decade tool in all cases? Or does the Forest Service have any plans to develop a tool that speaks to actual wildlife needs?
Thanks for the question, James. It's good to see you this morning too. Right now, the region has most of the wildlife biologists are using decade, but they're not limited to that. If in the future best available science, there's other things that come up that or we modify or evolve decade into a better tool, that's what we should be doing and what our intent is there. So that's why it's deliberate not to add decade to that standard. We said best available science. So they absolutely have it within their toolbox to use any best available science that would get the appropriate information and analysis in order to make a good decision on the ground. In terms of something better for wildlife, I would love to talk to you guys about that. We're always looking for additional things to leverage and inform and help our wildlife biologists and our line officers on the ground in terms of analysis and decisions that the line officers are making. Right now, Decade is pretty powerful because it does use the FIA GNN interface along with wildlife literature, both quantitative and qualitative, specific to the Pacific Northwest for wildlife species and studies that have been done here in this region. So that is the power of Decade, where it's sort of, we call it one-stop shopping for the wildlife biologist to be linking the vegetation data that we have available to us with the current scientific literature. Now, is there always updates that need to occur there? Absolutely. But again, we would love to talk to you guys if you have better ideas to do that, or maybe I could run you through the platform itself and we can do some brainstorming, but a collaboration on best available science for snags and downwood. At this point in time, Decade is the method that we have, and it has been supported and proven in terms of its longevity and use here in the Region 6.
Well, could I follow up, Barbara?
Sure, yeah. Nick, I'm assuming we're still good on time.
Go ahead, yes.
As far as I know, Decade is just comparing disturbed to undisturbed stands. And not surprisingly, one of those things has more snags than the other. As far as I know, it doesn't speak to wildlife needs in particular. It's just a comparison of reference to non-reference conditions, and is not serve as a basis for addressing the goals of the amendment, which is to maintain desired wildlife and wildlife habitat. And I'm wondering if the Forest Service has any actual plans to develop a tool that speaks to the objective of the amendment, or are we just going to keep relying on Decade forever?
So I think it actually does have a component that does that, but I think that's been some offline conversations that I know Emily has had, and I would love to engage this group in. Maybe perhaps we're not telling our Decade story correctly. Maybe it's a little bit ambiguous how Decade is being used in analyses, but I'm happy to provide an interface with each other and run you through the platform and then start to discuss this, because it actually does have that component and that linkage should be being made. And if it's not transparent and in light of what Craig led us with here in Leaders Intent, then we need to fix that. So please reach out, and maybe with this group, we can create a forum that takes a look at that platform. And if we're still feeling like it's missing the mark, then we collaboratively could work together to, provide what we think is the best available science into the future. But I would like to at least have that interface to be able to run folks through the platform itself, so you can see where those differences between the vegetation current versus reference that you discussed, and the comparison with current literature within the wildlife arena, and how those two link up and then inform the line officer in the decision.
Well, please feel free to send that information to me directly, because I'm not finding the actual, wildlife needs component to the tool interfaces that I'm viewing on Forest Service. I've got 3 different web pages open now, so I would love for you to send that around.
Okay. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yes, you bet. Great question. Thanks, James.
Thanks for the questions, everyone. And Barb, thanks very much for helping me out, providing your expertise there on the snag management components. Moving on, I'd like to invite Emily Platt in to present the old and large tree guideline. Emily, floor is yours.
All right, thanks, Nick. Okay, well, I wanted to start out by reminding folks that we're talking about changes that we made to 2 subsections of the entire Eastside screens. So there is something like 30 different management policies that comprise the Eastside screens, and we made changes to 2 of those. And this is really important context, especially for this old and large tree guideline. So we'll come back to that in a minute. So first thing I wanted to cover was the intent of the old and large tree guideline. You see it right there on your screen. Maintain and increase old and late structure forest and favor fire tolerant species where appropriate. So the most important thing here is to focus on keeping all the old trees, right? That's the first thing. If you have any old trees on the site, you keep them. Next, if you don't have enough old trees to meet and develop late and old structure forest conditions, you retain large trees. And again, you favor fire tolerant species. So there's a couple things to note here. One is that old trees are defined by external morphological characteristics, so visual characteristics, and that means we're not going to be coring a bunch of trees. We're going to be looking at things like fissure depth and other visual characteristics that help us identify old trees. We'll be using best available science to do that, and that may be modified as we learn things over the coming years as we implement this policy. Large trees are defined as grand fir and white fir over 30 inches DBH, any other species over 21 inches DBH. And then there's some additional language in there to basically consider landscape characteristics as you do this work. So consider things like aspect, south slopes will be drier, have less tree species, north slopes likely a little bit wetter. So just to consider those kinds of things when we're deciding how to manage stands across this landscape. Okay, Nick, let's go to the next slide. So this slide just highlights a couple of important things, and we're going to start in the upper left corner here. So the first thing to note is that this new large and old tree guideline doesn't apply everywhere across the landscape. So Nick, next slide. The new old and large tree guideline only applies outside of late and old structure forest. And again, remember that the rest of the Eastside screens remain in place. So that includes policies that cover management within late and old structure forest. That old 21-inch rule and the new guideline apply outside of LOS forests or late and old structure forest. Okay, next slide, Nick. So moving across the top of this flow chart here, if you're within, I'm sorry, yes, that's right. So if you're outside of late and old structure forest, I'm sorry, down the left side of the screen, you'll see you apply the old and large tree guideline. If you're within late and old structure forest, we're going to move across the top of the flow chart here. If you're within late and old structure forest, so, I'm sorry. The flow chart, we should have had Carrie do this. The flow chart honestly does not work for me. I'm a little bit more linear. So if you're within late and old structure forest, the first thing you want to ask is, are you within or outside of historical levels of late and old structure forest? And that is actually wrong. Nick, I'm sorry.
Emily, let's flip. We've got a few different ways we're presenting this information. Is this an easier format for you to present?
It's okay. Let's go back to the flow chart. It's totally fine. It's totally fine. Let me just try one more time. I'm sorry for confusing people. So moving across the top of the flow chart, if you're within late and old structure forest, you have to ask if you have one or two kinds of late and old structure forest. You can have late and old structure forest that has multiple layers, or you can have late and old structure forest that has just a single layer, so multi-strata or single strata. And then you want to know if each or both of those types of late and old structure forest is within historical levels. If you are within historical levels of late and old structure forest for either of those forest types, you can manage that forest. There are no species guidelines, there are no size guidelines. You have to maintain late and old structure forest. You have to enhance those late and old structure forest characteristics. And you can't go below historical levels of late and old structure forest. If you have two kinds of late and old structure forest, say multi-strata and single strata, and one is above within or above historical levels, and one is below, you can still manage that late and old structure forest that is within or above historical levels. So the most common way we see that out in the field is you have, you're either within or above historical levels of multi-strata latent old structure forest, and you're below for single strata latent old structure forest. If that's the case, you are allowed to manage that multi-strata latent old structure forest. Again, you cannot go below historical levels of that latent old structure forest, and you have to enhance latent old structure characteristics. So that next slide that Nick had up here, or maybe it's the last slide, Nick, now, but it does highlight that you can manage within latent old structure forest if you're in or above HRV. Again, you have to enhance those latent old structural characteristics. The idea of the Eastside screens and these large and old tree guidelines in general is to make sure we're maintaining old forest where it exists on the landscape, and that we're enhancing latent old structure characteristics where it's lacking. So sorry for the messy way of moving through that. And then this is, yes, Nick, this does work better for me. This is just like a little bit more of a linear way of looking at the same issue. So again, there's three main questions. Are you inside or outside of LOS? Are the LOS structural stages within historical levels, within or above historical levels? And then that helps you decide what you can and can't do across the landscape. So again, you can just read this through. It's the same thing we already covered. Just a different way of looking at that same information. So before we open it up for questions though, Carrie is here with us, and she might just want to add or clarify to something that we've covered on this old and large tree guideline, to just highlight something important or make something more clear for the things that I've said that have perhaps muddied the water. Carrie?
Sure. I think you covered it all. I'll just re-emphasize that, you know, as you're looking at a project and as a silviculturist, you're going to be, you've done your ecosystem, you've worked through your ecosystem standard, right? That's where all this HRV stuff comes from. And that's where all the LOS stuff comes from, the ecosystem standard part of the Eastside screens. So you're sitting here and you usually, like Emily said, you have this of old forest multi-strata, which is usually overdense forest with large trees in it. And then you have this old forest single strata, which is usually, you know, lots of old trees, and it's not overdense. So you usually don't have enough of that. This is, I don't know, 95% of the time on the east side, you know, that happens. So you can't have any timber sales in that old forest single strata, okay? Because that is what the point of the Eastside screens is to maintain that. That's what we want more of. But it also says in the Eastside screens that we want to take that multi-strata and we really want to convert that to a single strata. So we can use active management, timber harvest to do that under the Eastside screens.
Thanks, Carrie.
Thanks very much, Emily and Carrie. And yeah, as Emily stated, this is really the same information presented a few different ways. And what you're seeing on screen here, this is the document we call the decision tree. The one prior we referred to as the flow chart. We provided both of these to Forest Service staff on these 6 units. You see the note in the bottom left there. In all cases, we are to refer to the amendment itself when designing projects to ensure consistency with the land management plan. But this is complex stuff, and so we wanted to give it to people in a few different ways. If you're a more visual learner, this might work for you. If you're a more linear or sort of narrative type of information input person, then something like the decision tree might be a more effective way for you to process the information. But just to put it out there, they should all be consistent. 99.9% sure they are. Those different ways of viewing it. And our hope is that they're not only helpful for sort of staff to understand the amendment, but for you all as well. And so with that, definitely invite any questions you have on the old and large tree components of this amendment. I see some questions coming in via chat. First is from James, and it's directed to you, Emily. The question is, how is HRV determined for late and old structure for the purposes of determining if the new screen rules apply? So that actually, it was directed to you, so I'll let you field it, but goes back to what Carrie stated in terms of following through the ecosystem components of the Eastside screens that went unchanged by this amendment. So the same methodologies for there that were in place previously, right, Emily?
Yep, that's right. So it's the original Eastside screens language still applies there. And so there's certain things that you have to do when you assess HRV, but the specific process for coming up with HRV is not, there's not a specific way you have to do that. There are just certain factors you have to consider. I don't know if that's too vague, but it's the original Eastside screens language that applies. It looks like Lindsay has a question as well.
Yes, and we've got a couple more in the chat, but Lindsay, please go ahead.
Can you all hear me?
Loud and clear.
So I just was curious, in the outside of the LOS, the defined late and old structure, when we have, understory reinitiation, stem exclusion, we are seeing a consistent lack of early seral or stand initiation throughout the landscape based on HRV. How does this particular amendment apply when we're trying to recreate some of those stand characteristics across the landscape outside of LOS?
Right. Well, that is actually difficult. The Eastside screens and the Northwest Forest Plan were developed in a time where I don't know how to say this nicely, so I'll probably get in trouble here, but there's a real lack of old forest on the landscape, or we were targeting old forest for harvest, right? And so people were very concerned about its persistence. That was a long time ago. I think the Forest Service has been managing with a really different focus for quite a while now. But our policies and the things that guide our management are still focused on those issues that were bigger issues 20 years ago, right? And so I think to really be able to address what you're talking about, Lindsay, which I get it, I understand what you're saying, we really have to do forest plan revision. We have to rethink how all of our management policies are kind of overlaid, and be able to step back and take a bigger look at what we're trying to achieve across the whole landscape, and then create policies that help us do that, or sideboards that help us do that, basically. But I think there's things that are going to continue to be an obstacle in our current management plans, particularly for issues that have become issues more recently that just aren't reflected in our existing management plans. And if there is anyone else on this meeting that wants to address that or has perspective on it, go for it. That's just where I'm coming from.
Emily, I would just offer, it's a really good question, Lindsay, and thanks for that. And Carrie, I'll let you in here in one sec. This amendment was not intended to be a panacea for all things ailing our current forest management plans. It was really focused on addressing the one size fits all approach of the 21-inch limitation. And so our hope is that this successfully addressed that limitation and inflexibility, if you will, in terms of our management approaches for large and old trees. There are certainly other aspects of plan direction that need attention and are getting attention from our regional office planning staff, as well as at the unit levels. But Carrie, please, if you've got more to add.
Yeah, I would just add that I think, right, the intent of this is to keep the oldest and the largest trees outside of LOS to get more late and old structure, right? That's the point. So yeah, I think there's going to be some instances where we have, right, like stands dominated by grand fir or white fir. Those are the largest trees that are there, but it's not late and old structure forest. So we need to keep those trees, because they're the oldest and largest trees. I don't think, and this guidance points us in the right direction, right? This is at that scale where we're trying to point the ship, but I think there's still a lot of power and ability to make site-specific, project-specific prescriptions and project design criteria that can help move those stands towards the species composition that we want. So, right, so we're threading a needle here on forest plan direction, being so specific that it doesn't fit every situation. And I think we're doing okay. I think we still have opportunity out there to, there's nothing about spatial arrangement in here. You need to, on the ground, look at what is the spatial arrangement? Are all those old trees clumped together? Well, that might help us when we want to maybe recruit, more early cereal species. So, I would just make sure that we remember, like, this is that forest plan level direction, but we still have a lot of input at that stand scale.
Thanks. Can I just follow up real quick? One question that kind of stuck out earlier was when you were talking about applying this outside of LOS, you said, Emily, you said that you would be applying it to old trees first and then going on to large trees. So, and that's based on morphological characteristics. So if, hypothetically speaking, if the old trees are suppressed, less than 21 inches and they make up the required basal area, does that mean you can take all 21-inch trees, including the non-grand fir species?
Yeah, for sure. And then the one other thing I wanted to clarify, because this came up as we were doing the project, and it's maybe a nuanced point, but I know you guys deal with this issue a lot. So yes, first you keep all the old trees regardless of their size, and they might be smaller than 21 inches or 30 inches or whatever, right? So you keep those old trees. And then, if you do need to retain more large trees, we specifically took out the language that said the largest trees, because if you have, some large pine or even one or two large pine, and you have some grand fir that are a little bit bigger, I don't know, maybe they're 25 inches or whatever, you don't necessarily have to keep that grand fir. You could keep those 2 pine instead of the 2 grand fir. The intent here is to be able to help shift landscapes so that they are more adapted to their environment. And we know there's been this huge species composition shift, right? So this guideline should, it doesn't get us all the way there, right? The landscape has changed a lot, but it should help us do that more easily. So there is some flexibility on that large tree piece as well. Hopefully that helps.
Thanks, Emily and Carrie, and Lindsay, thank you for the questions. We've got 2 more in the chat here. One that I'll take on from Trent. It asks, timber sales aren't allowed in late and old structure if under HRV, but can there still be management to enhance late and old structure, for instance, small diameter thinning or removal of trees that aren't sold? And the answer there is yes. Looking at what we'd be in scenario A here, where we're under HRV within late and old structure forest, and the amendment makes clear that in that scenario, you can manipulate vegetative structure that does not meet late and old structure conditions in a manner that moves it towards these conditions as appropriate to meet HRV. It gets a bit more specific. It says maintain open park-like stand conditions where this condition occurred historically, manipulate vegetation in a manner to encourage the development and maintenance of large diameter open canopy structure. So while understory removal is allowed, the standard indicates that some amount of seedlings, saplings, and poles need to be maintained for the development of future stands. So Trent, I hope that addresses your question. Anything more you want to add on that front, Emily?
Nope, not from me. Carrie, do you want to clarify any of that? There's also a list of exceptions to the Eastside screens at the very beginning of the Eastside screens. And so a bunch of projects fit under those exceptions.
Nope, I don't have anything to add. That sounds right on.
I was reading straight from the amendment, so I'm glad I got that right. Carrie, if you would stay on here for a minute, I think this may be one for you. are there clear standards? This question's from Doug. Are there clear standards for what is in LOS versus outside of LOS? I can take that on, but I think you're probably better suited to address it in detail, Barry or Emily.
I can shoot first. So latent old structure forest and the classification of that is addressed in that ecosystem standard part of the screens. And if you pull that up, there's a table in there that describes what each structure is. And I think Lindsay was reading off of it earlier, right? It goes through, here's stand initiation, stem exclusion, and then you get down to the latent old structure, which are old forest multistrata or old forest single strata. And in the screens, there's a qualitative description of what that is. And so subsequent to when the screens, right, were signed, which many of you probably know this already, each forest or group of forests went through a process to classify their landscape under the new direction of the screen. So this is back in the mid to late 90s. And a lot of it based on potential vegetation and that kind of thing, to try and figure out, okay, well, where is our landscape? How are we going to do this HRV analysis? So there's no standard written into the Eastside screens that directs forests on how to classify HRV. There is guidance in there around how to do that, but there's no set standard.
Yep, thanks, Carrie. And we do have a regionally recommended approach that we make available to units, and certainly we support units with those determinations. But yep, as Carrie stated, there is no one-size-fits-all approach that the amendment dictates must be used to calculate HRV. We have one more question from Mark Webb, and then we'll move on to talk about the adaptive management strategy. So Mark, please.
I took my hand down, but what I was curious about, are there basal area targets associated with this? I'm thinking of a recent field trip where the Malheur retained all the old trees, predominantly pine, but a lot of younger fir, much of which was commercially valuable or merchantable, was left. It's still relatively open, but leaving that there arguably compromises the sort of species composition mix or trajectory the forest wants to see long term. Part of the reason we kept that is for basal area reasons or wildlife habitat sorts of considerations. Does this amendment address that at all, or free them up to be to take more of that?
I'm guessing that just came in from prescriptions and project level or forest level stuff. There's nothing about basal area in the Eastside screens. And most forests, when they're defining those latent old structure stages, they use trees per acre rather than basal area. So again, it's different. It varies by forest, but there's nothing in the Eastside screens about basal area.
Okay, thanks.
Yep.
Thanks, Emily and Carrie, and Mark, thanks for that question. With that, we'll move on, and I'll take the reins back, and we'll talk a bit about the adaptive management strategy for this amendment. So as you see on the screen now, there are really three primary components to this strategy. The first is data collection, the monitoring itself. So that entails both broad scale monitoring, looking at trends across the entire 6 forest project area covered by this amendment, as well as local monitoring. So that means monitoring conducted by local Forest Service units and multi-party monitoring that you all conduct to help us understand what we're seeing at the project level, if the outcomes of our prescriptions are as intended or not. So all that data will feed up into the work group. The adaptive management work group is a new entity that was put into place by this amendment. So we've committed to hold a meeting at least once a year, open to the public, to basically just put the data on the table, spread it out, and share what we're seeing with people, invite them to share what they're seeing with us as well. We have also committed situationally dependent. So if we're still in the midst of a pandemic and battling a Delta variant, we probably will not hold an annual field trip. But those conditions aside, presuming that we can safely gather in the field, we will commit to holding an annual field trip as well to put our boots on the ground and look at a project site. And so those are the two primary components to the work group. We'll talk a little bit more about each of these on the subsequent slides. And then lastly, the RF review. So every year, what we hear from the work group will be filtered up to the regional forester in a briefing style setting. So that meeting is not necessarily open to the public, but we bring forward what monitoring data we've collected and what we've heard from the work group to the regional forester every year. And then every 5 years, he or she is charged with making a decision as to whether we need to switch to an age-based standard. If the old and large tree guideline is not doing what we intended, is not putting us on a trajectory of having more old large trees on the landscape, then the regional forester is required to implement a age-based standard instead. And so we'll talk a little bit more about what that means, as I said, on these subsequent slides. Starting here with monitoring components. So broad scale monitoring, the required question, this is in the amendment itself, it states that each year we'll assess are large trees increasing in number while setting species composition on a trajectory appropriate to the ecological setting. So that's the broad scale question we have enshrined in the amendment, and we'll set out to answer each year with our monitoring data. That broad scale monitoring data is going to rely on FIA input and then supplemented, as we'll talk about in a bit, by local level monitoring data. So going back to broad scale, the second question that is stated as an optional question in the amendment. So this is spelled out in the amendment in these terms, but it's not a required one to apply. It's just optional. Is the density, quality, and distribution of snags improving across the landscape? So we want to know that basically to understand the effects of our projects. Again, is what we expected to happen happening, but it's optional in the sense that it's not going to trigger a determination from the regional forester to switch to a different plan component, whereas that first question with the asterisk would. And then lastly, the amendment highly recommends that we work with the adaptive management work group to develop an age-related monitoring question. And in the interest of full disclosure, we teased this around quite a bit, tossed this around quite a bit with the project team that developed the amendment and tried to come up with a purely age-based monitoring question ourselves. We were unable to come up with one that was practicable and relevant enough to really point to the information we're after. And so we're going to invite input from you all. Help us understand if there is an age-related monitoring question that does what we want it to do. That's going to be something that we ask for your input on in the work group. And then with regard to local monitoring, this will be project level and can either be Forest Service or partner led. So it's really a call for support from you all to help us monitor our projects that use this amendment and bring that data forward to the adaptive management work group when we meet. So the work group itself will meet annually. The regional office, that's the resource planning and monitoring staff and our natural resources staff, the two teams that are contributing to the webinar today, will host and facilitate that annual meeting. The intent there is to share knowledge about the development of late and old structure conditions. And the first session this winter, recognizing that the first tranche of projects to use the amendment are in the very early stage at this point, have not really been implemented on the ground. So we don't have real monitoring data to look at quite yet. So our first session that we'll hold this winter, likely in January, we'll focus on reviewing these early adopter projects and just giving you a sense for what's happening out there on the ground using this amendment. Field trips would be once a year, a multi-party field tour. And again, that's assuming there's no pandemic or other conditions that keep us out of the fields. And will require support from the host unit. So we did have an opportunity to host a similar webinar like this for Forest Service staff on these 6 units a couple of weeks back, and we put that call out to them. That will need their support in hosting those field trips when that time comes. Definitely welcome suggestions from you all as well. If there's a project that you're either excited about, perhaps concerned about, and want to bring a group out to see firsthand, we welcome that information and encourage you to get in touch and suggest that. And then the last component of the adaptive management strategy is this regional foresters review. So as I stated, every year, the regional forester, as well as the directors for the planning and natural resources staff in the RO, a forest supervisor representing these 6 units, and the Pacific Northwest Research Station director will meet to review the monitoring data and process what we heard from the adaptive management work group. That's annually. And then every 5 years, this is also required, the regional forester makes a determination on whether to institute that age-based standard. So it goes back to that monitoring question. Are large trees increasing in number with appropriate species composition? If the data shows they are not, the regional forester is required to institute an age-based standard on at least a portion of the planning area. Also, if effectiveness monitoring does not occur, so if we don't follow through on our commitment to review that broad scale monitoring data every year, the regional forester will again be required to institute an age-based standard in the place of the old and large tree guideline. Something to keep in mind here is that if the regional forester determines that he does need to institute the age-based standard, that can be limited to just a portion of the planning area. It's also agnostic as to cause. So if there is a severe large-scale disturbance that basically wipes out a lot of large trees and creates a condition where the monitoring data shows us that large trees are not increasing in number due to that disturbance, the regional forester would need to institute an age-based standard. In that case, he could limit that determination to just the portion of the planning area that was affected by that severe disturbance, and so would allow that flexibility in the rest of the planning area to continue to apply the old and large tree guideline. So we can dig a little bit more into all of that. Oh, and I'm glad I remembered to state this before the call out box appeared, but again, here it is in bright red fonts. If either trigger is met, the regional forester must switch to an age-based standard for at least part of the planning area, regardless of the cause of that finding. So before we go back to Q&A, just wanted to reiterate some of our key takeaways for the presentation overall. First, the old and large tree guideline applies outside of late and old structured forest only. We're using external morphological characteristics, visual characteristics, not tree cores to assess age. Snags are to be retained as needed to support diverse wildlife. The adaptive management work group will meet for the first time this winter. That meeting will be virtual, considering the continued limitations from the pandemic on in-person meetings. And that meeting will focus on reviewing some of the early adopter projects that use the amendment. And then field trips in the future will be held as projects are implemented. Do not expect a field trip to be held this year. So with that, we greatly thank you all for your attention and welcome any questions you have on anything we presented today. We've got, I think, about 25 minutes remaining in our allotted time, so plenty of time for conversation. And we can certainly go back and review any of the slides we presented if that would be helpful. We can also invite our team members from the regional office on to help field any more technical questions. And with that, I welcome your questions and comments. I see some have come in the chat.
I see Mark's hand raised. Mark, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, could you go, Nick, could you go back to the first slide under the monitoring program, please?
I think I can. There we go. Is this the one you're looking for?
Yeah, the broad scale. So I'd appreciate hearing from the Forest Service maybe a bit more explicitly how you understand that first box. Are large trees increasing in number while species composition on a trajectory appropriate to the ecological setting? I think I know what y'all mean, but I can certainly see for work on the Malheur where what's ecologically appropriate might mean removing a large number of large trees. So they're going in different directions. And I just want to hear from you all how you view that. I assume it's going to be HRV related, but it'd be nice to know that. It's one
So
question.
Fred, I see you came on screen. I would just, before I toss it to you, reiterate that that second phrase in the question there is specific to species composition. So rather than number of large trees, when we're talking about appropriate to the ecological setting, that's really focused on the species composition component. But Craig, please, you have more to share on that?
Sure, I can go from more of a layperson standpoint, and then Emily or Carrie can fill in. So Mark, when I saw this one, I had questions as well about how can we be going and removing large trees and have large trees increasing. And so we're looking at the entire landscape, essentially the entire Malheur National Forest, not just the project area when we're looking at this. So our large trees increasing overall. And so a lot of our treatments are really to prevent catastrophic wildfires and things like that. So when we're doing these fuels treatments, we're protecting more than just that treatment unit with that and allowing larger trees to grow in more than just where we're doing the treatments, if that makes sense.
And then I might just add that this might surprise some folks, but it's totally consistent with the science. In managed areas, our large trees are doing better than in unmanaged areas, right? And so they're anyway, that's just what the data is showing us. So the idea here is we certainly want to track large trees and make sure we're continuing to grow large trees across the landscape. And there's recognition that we're going to remove some large grand fir trees. That's one of the issues we see out there, right? So we can still increase overall the number of large trees on the landscape while we're doing that.
Okay, maybe my question's more about basal area but the screens don't address that. Anyway, per data on the Malheur, we probably have more large trees than we did historically. So I'm just concerned about implementing this in a way that means that y'all can monitor it appropriately. And that's why I'm asking the question. So thanks.
Sure. I would say the other thing is we might, I hope we'll continue to learn a lot as we move forward. And so any ideas or thoughts you all have about this as you're thinking about it on your own forest will be really helpful. And that's another reason for that annual meeting, so that we can continue to work with each other as we move forward and learn about all this stuff. So.
And Nick, if I may, one follow-up question, just I'd also like to ask the Forest Service, so I supported the monitoring component here strongly, but I'm not clear how realistic it is to make this kind of assessment every year or every 5 years about an increased number of large trees on the forest, unless you're talking about it in a way that Craig is, to where you're taking everything into account as opposed to the managed areas. Is it really reasonable to think that based on 2 or 3 years active management, we can identify more large trees in these areas as a result of those treatments? Maybe it's a crazy question, just say that it is.
Well, no, it's a good question, Mark. And I would say, again, the monitoring data is going to be agnostic as to cause. So it's not just in the managed stands. This is across the entire project area, all 6 forests. So managed and managed stands on that really broad geographic scale. We're going to do that using FIA data. That those plots are taken every year, and so we do have a reliable source for assessing that. Maren Palmer, I know our biometrician, is on the line. I don't know if she's got more to add on that front, but hopefully that addresses those questions. Craig, do you have more to share on that?
No, I think you covered it, Nick.
Thanks for those questions, Mark. And yeah, Maren, I see you unmuted for a sec. Come on in if you've got more to say on that front.
Yeah, hi everybody. Hopefully you can see and hear me. So the only thing I would add, we are working to figure out, the format of the first monitoring report using FIA data. We do have good data about large trees that can be split by species composition. They can be split by like potential natural vegetation groups. So, within that, ecological settings that would have similar range of variation and expectations, so they can be split by different ways. So as we develop those first reports, it's going to be really important at that initial adaptive management work group meeting to have discussion about, is this the right way to split the data that's telling us what we are, really answering the questions we want to answer on those landscapes. So I would just say, we're working to get that set up, and the more input from the broader audiences there, the better. But that said, we also want something that is going to be responsive to the actual resources we have in the agency to develop these and, produce good monitoring on an annual basis. So we are, I think it was set up to very specifically use existing data sets and existing publicly available data where we can.
Thanks, Maren. Appreciate you jumping in there. So I see a couple more questions in the chat and a hand up from Lindsay. And Lindsay, I see you directed some questions straight to me in the chat as well. I'm going to go ahead and take those on quickly. So first, it asks, I thought we were concerned about old trees first. It seems that this puts the emphasis on the large tree component. And so again, we thought hard about how to develop a purely age-based monitoring question and came up empty. So you're correct. The large tree, the required broad-scale question there focuses on large trees and species composition, but that's essentially a proxy for a precise measure of how many old trees are on the landscape, because FIA data simply can't pull that information. So Emily, do you have more to share on that question?
Yeah, just a nuance. That's true. I think, one of the reasons we didn't add an old tree question in there is because I think the question most people are interested in is the Forest Service cutting old trees? Is this, are visual characteristics enough to be able to identify old trees? And that is really, it's not an effectiveness monitoring question, and that's what we were really focused on. And the FIA data is not good enough on old trees. That's just not, there's not enough old trees in the data set to be able to make the kinds of generalizations across the landscape that we want to be able to make. So there are other, if the monitoring group decides what we really want to monitor is, hey, is the Forest Service cutting old trees? We can add that in and find a way to look at that. But we don't have good existing data on old trees across the landscape. That was the limitation. And we didn't have huge amounts of extra money to spend to gather that information. So that was the part of the conundrum, at least, that we were dealing with on that piece.
So can I just follow up on that question real quick? So in 5 years, if we don't see an increase in large trees, it goes to an old tree standard. Where is that the same standard as the second alternative in the environmental assessment? So that it would go, we would remove the large tree component and go directly to an old tree standard. So there would be no diameter limitation on any trees if we are not feeling that this particular amendment is successful. Is that what I'm understanding?
If the data is showing that large trees are not increasing on number with an appropriate species composition, then yes, we would revert to that. We'll switch to that age-based standard described in that alternative in the EA. And that could only be, though, for a portion of the planning area. So we can look more specifically at that FIA data and home in on the specific forest or district or fire perimeter, perhaps, where we're seeing that pull down that average and institute the age-based standards simply on that sub-geography of the overall planning area.
So
but
you
for
could,
some portion of the planning area, we would revert to an age standard.
so you could differentiate it based on stand type, whether it be cool, moist, or warm, dry.
Potentially, yes.
Okay, thanks.
A couple other questions that I saw you sent to me, Lindsay. The adaptive management work group, is this just a public meeting? Yes, it's open to the public. There's no set representation or membership on that work group. It's just our opportunity to share information with the public, with you all, and to give you an opportunity to share what you were seeing with us. And then what happens if there's a new forest plan adopted that doesn't incorporate this amendment as written? Well, then whatever we write in that new forest plan applies. These are incremental changes we're making to these forest plans. Revisions, the real way to get new components in place for the entire forest plan. And so if that happens, that should be a holistic revision that supplants everything in the Eastside screens. So a few more questions that came in via chat. From Doug first, is abundant large trees defined anywhere? My knee-jerk reaction is no. I'm not sure where that phrase abundant large trees appears, but Carrie or Emily, are you able to help me out with that?
I'm not sure where Doug is seeing abundant large trees either.
Doug, if you're able to unmute and clarify your question, we'd be happy to address it more specifically. Maybe while we're waiting for Doug, I'll skip to the next one, and it's from Trent. If large-scale wildfire is included in the measure of decrease in large trees, and given the number of large fires occurring, over 100,000 acres, let alone something like the 400,000 acre bootleg fire, then by default, the number of large trees will go down. Should we be expecting the trigger to be met? And the regional forester will have to switch to an age-based approach. I think that we'll have to wait and see on that one, Trent. We're all seeing the prevalence of large fires on the landscape. It's certainly a possibility that the impacts from those disturbances are so extensive that that's the primary driver in our assessment of that monitoring question. That's certainly a possibility. Far be it for me at this point to say that that's what we're expecting. There's a possible future in which we're able to get enough large-scale restoration done in these next 5 years that we can change that trajectory. But I'm not in the business of predicting the future. Craig, do you have more to add on that?
Well, I think you mentioned it before that the regional forester has the ability to choose a portion of the revision project area. And so at that point in time, the regional forester may say, okay, using the bootleg fire as an example, within the perimeter of the bootleg fire, we're going to go to an age-based standard, or within the Fremont portion of the Fremont-Winema, we're going to go to an age-based standard based upon the impacts within that specific geographic area. So I think, I fully expect we'll probably see something like that somewhere in our landscape over the next 5 years, where the outcome will be this happening, but I think it doesn't mean it would happen across all 6 national forests.
Thanks, Craig. So about 10 minutes remaining. I do see that Doug clarified his question about the phrase abundant large trees, and he states it's related to the definition of LOS. So I think we're looking at table 1 of the ecosystem standard here.
Yeah, so generally, I mean, forests have defined it differently, but generally forests are using a number of trees per acre to more specifically define that level of abundance. Carrie, do you want to add anything more detailed than that? And thanks, Doug.
Yeah, I can just add. So I think that really like there's kind of been 2 different slightly different ways of categorizing that, and Central Oregon has kind of worked through the ecologists through the decades, Mike Simpson, who just recently retired, being one of those, to really help them define and work through that HRV process. And then Blue Mountains have used a variety of methods over the years and had some different direction around, you know, what HRV values to use, and you know, how those LOS, well, actually how all the structural stages are defined, and some of that was developed and used through the Blue Mountain Forest Plan revision and other things. So, but they're all, like Emily said, really, you know, so, as a broad brush, you know, 10 trees per acre over 21 inches in certain vegetation types is something that's been used pretty broadly in the Blue Mountains, and then that's also been applied in portions of Central Oregon. So so folks have varied that depending on if that's appropriate for their project or not, or they have, you know, added other things based on input for the project or whatever groups they're working with.
Thanks, Carrie. And thanks for the question, Doug. So I don't see any other questions in the chat currently. Please feel free to unmute yourself, raise a hand, or just drop something in the chat if you have additional questions. Well, I'm hearing none. I'm going to go ahead and drop my email address in the chat box here. I neglected to include it on a slide, so my apologies for that. But if you all come up with questions, suggestions, ideas in the future, I'd certainly encourage you to reach directly out to me. You should now see my email address there in the chat. It's nicholas.goldstein@usda.gov. So fairly easy to remember. We've standardized those USDA email addresses for the most part at this point. With that, I really do appreciate everybody's attendance, your questions, your attention. Thanks very much to Sally and Sustainable Northwest for providing us with the forum and helping us get the word out through your networks. And thanks a ton to our Forest Service presenters. Really appreciate all the expertise you provided today. And we look forward to seeing you all at the Adaptive Management Work Group come January. We will be circulating information out about that once we have a date in place, and we will likely look to our friends at Sustainable Northwest to help get word out to you all at that time as well. So with that, again, thanks very much, and have a great rest of your day, everyone. Sally, I'll toss it back to you to close out.
Thanks, Nick. So we did record this, and we'll share the recording afterwards. We did get a question if the slides will be available. Nick, are you able, is that okay for me to send out?
Yeah, let me send you a PDF version, Sally, just so we make sure they stay in the form that we sent them out in. But yeah, absolutely, be happy to share those slides.
That would be great. All right, thanks everyone. If you have any questions, let us know, but you'll be hearing from us shortly.
Thank you.